Today, I'm going to be walking you through my setup on my Ari Superior Peak. I've got this bike built up in a slightly unconventional way. It's got a 190mm travel single crown fork. The front brake goes through the steer tube so that I can bar spin, and it is set up as a single speed despite still having a derailleur. On top of all of those things, what really sets this bike apart to me is the amount of adjustability built into the frame. Being able to test different shock mounts on this bike was really eye-opening to me and made me question how I would traditionally set up a bike for freeride. So let's dive into it. So I am 5'11" tall, and I am riding the S1 of this frame, which in the mullet setup has a reach of 432.5 millimeters. For a rider of my height, this would typically be seen as way too small of a bike. But for me and for a freeride application, I really like riding a small compact setup. Gives me a lot of leverage over the front end of the bike to pop off of lips and flat drops, and it just makes a super agile setup, which I have come to love. For wheel size, I'm rocking this bike with dual 27.5-inch wheels, once again to help with the overall agility of the bike, and having the smaller 27.5 front wheel on there in particular helps a lot with doing bar spins. This bike is designed around running dual 29-inch wheels or a mullet setup. So with me running dual 27.5, my setup is a bit unique. For the chainstay setting on this bike, I have it in the short setting, which puts it at 444 millimeters, which is actually the longest chainstay I have ever ridden. At first, I was a bit worried about the longer chainstay on the Superior Peak, as I thought it was going to hinder my ability to do 360s on jumps and drops. But to be honest with you, I haven't found that to be the case. Yes, it is a bit more bike to spin than what I was previously used to, especially off of a flat drop. But after I adjusted my riding to the bike, I have actually found the longer chainstays to be a benefit. Currently, I'm working on taking 360 drops to bigger and bigger setups, and so far, the longer rear end on this bike has really helped the bike feel stable in the air and given me a lot of confidence. Now, you may be listening to this and be like, why the heck doesn't this guy just ride a bigger frame if he is enjoying the increased stability from the longer back end on the Superior Peak? That's a totally valid question, and here's my answer. So with this bike and its longer chainstay, it adds stability to the frame without decreasing the leverage I have over the front end of the bike, which a longer reach would accomplish. For me, I'm really particular to how much leverage I have over the front end of the bike for freeride, and through the years of testing a bunch of different setups, I have found a reach number between 430 and 440 to work really well for me. Gives me a ton of control over the front end of that bike, which allows me to do 360 drops, 360s on jumps, tail whips, all that good stuff that I'm trying to do, and that is why riding the S1 of this frame was the right call for me. This frame in the S1 size and the mullet configuration has a reach of 432.5 millimeters. So then you toss a single crown fork on there at 190mm travel and a 27.5 front wheel. That number is going to increase slightly. So with all that being said, this bike falls just about in my sweet spot of somewhere between 430mm reach and 440mm reach. Hypothetically, if I were to jump up frame size to the S2 of the Superior Peak, that thing's got a reach of 472.5 millimeters in the mullet configuration, which I think would be a touch long for me for a freeride setup from what I have found, but it should feel pretty damn good in a bike park. Additionally, I could run a dual crown fork and use a reach adjust headset. It's a really cool feature of this bike is that it has big enough headset cups where you can run a reach adjust headset, so we just love to see that from the folks at Ari. Overall, that's how I ended up on the S1 frame size, and those are my thoughts on the 444 chainstay. Previously, I had always thought that a shorter chainstay would be better for freeride, but at the moment, this bike's got me questioning that. Wrapping up the frame details, let's take a look at the seat stay stiffness bridge as well as the interchangeable shock mounts. For the seat stay bridge, I did pop that thing out for a few laps, and I didn't notice a massive difference for my application, so I just tossed it back in there. Figured it's only going to make the back end of the bike stronger, which is great when you're landing sideways on 360s and things like that. So not something that I am taking full advantage of, but I think it's a great option to have, and it's a really cool thing that Ari has included on this frame. Looking now at the interchangeable shock mount, this has to be my favorite feature of this bike. I've never owned a bike with an interchangeable shock mount like this before, and I have found it to be a complete game changer. When I first built up this bike, I built it up with the progressive mount here, as I assumed for freeride I would need the progressive setup, but that assumption was wrong. For my initial shock settings, I ran the Marzo Bomber Air at 215 PSI with the stock tune and no volume spacer installed with the progressive shock mount. With that setup, I was able to ride well, but I found that the bike was a bit too progressive for my personal preference. What I found with this initial setup on my first day of riding was that despite having adequate travel usage with the shock, I was struggling to get the mid-stroke support that I was looking for, which made it challenging to weight the front end properly and led to a bit of instability. However, I was able to increase the compression on the rear shock and increase the spring rate by 5 PSI, which made me feel a bit more comfortable, and I was able to ride well my first day riding on this bike, but I knew I was gonna need to try that linear shock mount. After that first day of riding, I was convinced that was gonna be the ticket, and to be honest with you, I was so convinced I was going to be using the progressive mount that on my first day of suspension testing for this thing, I didn't even bring the linear mount, which in retrospect, that wasn't the best idea, but this goes to show how convinced I was that the progressive mount was gonna be the way for me. So after making some changes to my shock settings to get myself comfortable on that first day of riding with the progressive mount, heading into my second session on this bike, I kept the shock settings the exact same and I switched to the linear mount. Right away, I could notice a huge difference from the linear shock mount. It increased the amount of mid-stroke support that I had, and it increased the amount of fork travel that I was using, which was a great sign of there being more weight on the front end of the bike. On their website, Ari does recommend using the linear mount for a smaller volume air shock like the Marzo Bomber Air here. So I should have just listened to them from my initial setup, but I didn't. And honestly, I'm pretty stoked that I had the chance to try both shock mounts back to back. That was a really cool experience. I should have had a GoPro on for the first lap I did with the linear mount because I was like tripping by how much different it felt. It was really cool. But overall, if I were to build up this bike with a coil shock, I think the progressive mount would be dope for that. But for my use, the linear mount works great. And I'm just stoked to have a bike where I can try 2 different shock mounts and learn about how changing the kinematic can affect the rear shock's performance. All in all, those are all the details about my frame setup on this Ari Superior Peak. And now that we are already partially on the topic, let's discuss my final suspension settings. Building off of what I just mentioned about the linear shock mount, I was super stoked, as mentioned before, that it increased my mid-stroke support, and I'm able to continue running the Marzo Bomber Air without a volume spacer in there, and I'm having no issues with bottom out resistance. I find that with this shock and this shock mount, it strikes a really nice balance for my personal preference between it being progressive enough to not have issues on the big hits, but also being linear enough to have the mid-stroke support that I want and adequate weight on the front end of the bike. With all that being said, I have increased my spring rate in the Bomber Air up to 230 PSI, and I've now got a heavy compression tune in the shock. What led me to make both of those decisions is, for one, I was looking for just a touch more weight over the front end of the bike, so the heavier compression and the slightly increased spring rate just help lift the rear and put more weight into my hands, which I was looking for. And on a few particular splatty drops, I like the rear shock to sit into the travel enough to where it actually softens the impact, but I don't like it to sit in too much where the rebound after is kind of changing my body posture on the bike. So that's kind of a hard thing to articulate, but that's sort of what I was looking for. And anyways, the reason I'm mentioning this is the increased spring rate and the heavier tune on the compression do help with the bottom out slightly, but they're not exactly targeted towards bottom out resistance as a volume spacer would be. Now that we've talked about a whole bunch of various rear shock settings, let's combine it all into my final setup. So we've got the linear shock mount, a Marzo Bomber Air with 230 PSI, no volume spacer. That rebound is at 4 clicks from open. The low speed compression dial is at a half turn from open. I've got the stock rebound tune in there and a heavier compression tune. For the fork, we got that thing set up at 67 PSI, no volume spacers, 6 clicks from closed low speed compression, 6 clicks from closed high speed compression, and I got the rebound wide open as fast as it goes. Overall, these fork settings are a touch odd, especially for a freeride setup, but they're working really well for me. As mentioned earlier, with the increased spring rate in the rear shock and the heavy compression tune. Those two decisions were made to put more weight into my hands and increase my fork travel use. I started off running this fork at 80 PSI with one volume spacer, which was a setting I had used in some bikes previously, so I figured it'd just be a good base to start. And over time, this thing has dropped down to 67 PSI and no volume spacer to get the fork travel I'm looking for and overall feel. Given the relatively low spring rate relative to how I am riding this bike and the impacts it is taking, that is why the rebound on the fork is wide open, because your rebound is relative to that spring rate. Now that we've got the frame details and suspension all covered, let's take a look at the rest of the bike. But before we do, if you're enjoying this video, please consider dropping it a like and please consider subscribing for more uploads with this Superior Peak in the future. Looking at the wheels, we have the RaceFace Arc 30 rims laced up to their Volt hubs. This is the second set of wheels that I built up myself, and thankfully they're holding up strong. I was a little worried, but so far they've taken some big impacts nicely. And mounted up to those rims, we have a Maxxis Assegai 2.5, 27.5 EXO Plus, and this front wheel is set up tubeless. My reasoning for running tubeless in the front is it keeps the rotational weight down, which makes bar spins a lot easier. We got a cool little gold valve stem there. Now in the back, we have the Maxxis DHR downhill casing with a Tubelito tube. I don't run tubeless in the back as I find it really easy to burp and lose air when you're doing 360s. And this is my first time running the Tubelito tube, also trying to save a bit of rotational weight there. So that is the wheel and tire setup. For the drivetrain, we have a full Shimano Saint setup. So we're running the Saint crank, 165 mil length with a 36 tooth chainring. We have a Shimano top guide on there. And then in between the drive side crank arm in the frame is a rubber plumbing coupling, which is used as a crank stop. So it just reduces how much my cranks can spin when I'm doing no-footed tricks. And in the back here, we have the Saint derailleur with a small 4-speed cassette, which is just a Shimano Ultegra cassette missing the top 6 gears. And for the actual Saint derailleur itself, I have it set up as a tensioner, this time using a spoke to hold it in place. So here's a detailed look at my Saint tensioner setup because a bunch of you have been commenting about it. So in this particular instance, I'm using a RaceFace straight pull spoke to enter where the shift cable would and connect where the shift cable would, and that holds this in place. Now to get it in place, I do use the limit screws and then I just tension the spoke where it needs to be. Then I back off those limit screws. My reasoning for this is when you are relying on the limit screws to hold your derailleur in place as a tensioner, just wears everything down over time from my experience, and it's not a very reliable setup. So this works a lot better. Honestly, I'm trying out the spoke right now just to stiffen up the whole tensioner and reduce some noise, and it was a pain in the butt to set up. I wouldn't recommend it. A short piece of shift cable does the job perfect in this specific case. Up at the front of the bike now, taking a look at my cockpit setup. So we're rocking the RaceFace Turbine handlebar, 760 mil width, 40 mil rise. Traditionally, I would run a wider bar on a downhill bike, but the 760 mil width is crucial for making sure that those bar spins are slinging around. Now we've got the RaceFace Atlas stem, 35 mil length. I really like this stem. It's got great marks for your bar roll, which is a small feature of that stem I really enjoy. And we're running the RaceFace Jester grips, black clamps, black rubber, and this is the smaller of the two offerings in the 31 millimeter diameter. Of all the components that make up this bike, perhaps the most important for the way that I ride is my brake setup. So on this bike, we have the Shimano XTR levers paired to the Shimano Saint calipers. We have 200 mil Shimano Frezza rotors. I think I'm saying that right, front and rear. We got resin pads in those calipers. With this setup, I'm able to get such great modulation and such great power, and it gives me so much confidence when I'm riding lines like this one, where I need really great brake control in crucial sections. To wrap up this bike check, let's take a look at a few of the smaller details. So we've got the brand new RaceFace Turbine pedals in silver on this bike. This has been a super rad pedal. I'm really stoked on how they've been feeling. And I actually had to hide these things from you guys when I did the build video of this bike. I built up the bike with Atlas pedals, took the photos with them on there, and then as soon as I went riding, popped those things off, put these on, I got them a month early, and they've been so dope, and I'm really enjoying them. So new pedal, check them out, super stoked on them. Now for the seat, we have the Title JS1 seat, it's my go-to, and we got the RaceFace Turbine seat post, and scattered throughout the bike, we have some Better Bolts Gold titanium hardware. So that's all for this bike check on the Ari Superior Peak. If you have any questions about my setup, please drop them down in the comments below. I'll definitely get back to you. Thank you so much for watching this week's video, and we'll see you next Monday for a new upload. Peace.